Great. So this is week 43 of the EA for Christians weekly discussion groups. And today's topic is EA for citizens of middle or low income countries. So starting off as ever, and I want to do this more often, just reminding us all what effective altruism is. And we mean by effective altruism both an idea of using reason and evidence to find the very best ways to do good in the world. And we also mean the community of people throughout the world who seek to think carefully about this idea and to apply it to their own lives. So how do we apply EA? Our in-house definition is to carefully steward our resources of time, money, and advocacy to do the most good. And you can think of three practical ways to do this. These are not the only ways, but our focus and within the broader EA community, it's definitely a focus on donations, on career choice, and on advocacy of very important causes. So I want to start off today by thinking about this question of who do you think of as a famous effective altruist? Maybe there's a philosopher that comes to mind, or some particular name or very influential person or person involved in the movement. Maybe someone on this call, maybe, we'll see. And if you go to the Wikipedia page for effective altruism, you get this list of notable effective altruists. Some of these are definitely familiar to all of you, like Peter Singer or William McCaskill. There's a few others like Dustin Moskovitz. He's one of the Facebook co-founders and so forth. And then some other names who may or may not be familiar with you. I have in parentheses the countries where they come from. And you'll notice that all but one of these famous EAs come from a wealthy Western country, particularly from the US, from the UK, or Australia. And if you look at the average income in these countries, the IMF estimates that in the US, UK, Australia, you're talking about roughly $50,000, $60,000 a year in purchase parity power. You can compare this to other countries in the world where there are active EA movements, like in the Czech Republic, which nominally speaking has an income of 24,000 a year per capita, or in South Africa with about half that, or in the Philippines with even less. So there's a big disparity between where the most famous EAs come from and where other EA groups are in terms of that country's average income. And this sort of leads to this question that Jakub Sinovic, I can't pronounce his last name, but sorry, Jakub, that Jakub raises, which is effective altruism becoming an option for the rich? And that's something we can ask ourselves here. So as a quick roadmap, I want to spend the next 5 minutes just looking at what does the EA, the idea, and the community have to offer to EAs in low and middle income countries. 2, look at some challenges that EAs in low and middle income countries might have that might be unique. And then 3, also look at unique opportunities. And a quick disclaimer, I myself am American, and the circumstances of people in these situations are, of course, very different from my own. So I lack a lot of relevant knowledge. I just want to give an intro talk to this to help us to get thinking about this. And some of you will definitely have experiences that will complement and add to mine and supersede mine. And of course, needless to say, there's no moral superiority to being born in a wealthier country, just like there's no inferiority to being born in a poorer country. And this is, I think, a pretty widespread EA idea that it's very much a matter of what you do with what you have. And when we think of the parable of the widow and her mite, she gives all that she has to the offering box, as opposed to the Pharisee who gives very much, but still keeps very much at the same time. I think that's a healthy reminder before we start making assumptions about superiority, inferiority. No, I think that's all a bit nonsense. So yeah, I wanted to make that clear. So the first question, what does EA have to offer to EAs in low and middle income countries? And by low and middle income country, just to be clear, I'm talking about not one of these high income countries with primarily English speaking populations. I think the World Bank has more specific definitions. Middle income countries somewhere in the tens of thousands, low tens of thousands of dollars per year. Low income country is somewhere below $4,000 per year, but I don't want to set a rather arbitrary line here. I think we're all generally thinking of the same thing. And yeah, the first answer I would suggest to this question is that EA proposes the same exciting paradigm for doing good. The same ideas of doing the most with your resources, with your money, with your time, with your advocacy. This is something that people everywhere, regardless of where they are or when they live, that they can think about carefully and apply in their own lives. And yeah, just a little bit more on this point here. I also want to add that even people in with less giving potential still have a tremendous opportunity to make a massive impact through their giving. If you take someone in a middle income country, I think Jakob considered Czech Republic to be, or a lot of Central European countries to be middle income. If people in these countries give 10% of their income away to a charity like AMF or another give well recommended charity, they can still have a person with a normal income could still save more lives than a doctor in the US doing direct work as a doctor. So that's just one short example, and I'm happy to show the math of how I get that later. But suffice to say, there's agreement among many EAs that even people with lower incomes than might be the average in a wealthy country still has a tremendous opportunity. But the paradigm itself, using resources wisely to help others, this is something that strikes me as universal. But the second thing the EA has to offer EAs in low middle income countries is an invitation to a global community. Our online community is one example of this. On this call, we have people from 5 or 6 different countries, maybe more. And EA, to some extent, is welcoming of people regardless of where they're from. And one great way we are is through online events. Now I want to move on to some challenges. So the first, well, you can think of many different challenges. And again, this is going to be a pretty gross generalization, but it's really just to get us thinking. The first challenge is, of course, financial. It's much harder for somebody who's living on less to give a larger percentage of their income. It's also harder for them to give in gross terms more money away, or to have a contribution through that way. There are also professional obstacles in terms of finding work nearby that has an avenue for an impact, but also progressing in your career and building career capital is something that's a bit more challenging in some countries as opposed to in others. But then there are also cultural and traditional and philosophical challenges that in a country like in the US or in the UK, we might take for granted. There might be more agreement in terms of where we're coming from philosophically than if you come from a land where there's very different cultural or traditional or philosophical assumptions, ones that might not be as suitable for the kinds of philosophical analytics that the EA does. So I think we can think of examples here, but I don't want to get too deep in the weeds. And a second challenge I would propose is just limitations of the EA community itself. I hinted at this earlier. Effective altruism does have many online events, but a lot of the in-person events are still in the US, in the UK, in Australia. A lot of the EA global events are held in a lot of these same wealthy English-speaking countries. And a lot of the active groups are in these countries as well. And that produces some challenges for people who don't live in these countries or don't have access to these countries or these events otherwise. So yeah, so more on this. EA orgs also have a stronger hiring network within their circles. I think this is fairly intuitive, but I think this has a strong effect on who actually gets hired in an EA organization, and not just EA organizations, but organizations in general seem to hire within their circles, and their circles seem to be to some extent geographically defined. But also there's this assumption often within the EA community that English, exceptional talent, high salary, these things are just present among EA members. And I think this is an assumption that some people have, and I think it's a very unhealthy assumption, and it can lead to some people feeling excluded just not, it just doesn't seem appropriate in many circumstances. There are also some opportunities that EAs in low and middle income countries would have that an EA coming from a wealthier country might not have. So in summary, I want to reaffirm, I think there still is high potential to do good among one of the EA pathways, depending on someone's circumstance: donations, career, advocacy. One opportunity is, of course, to live and work abroad or work remotely for an EA organization. Another is something that 80,000 Hours talks a bit about when they write about this topic, which is that traditional social impact jobs like teachers, like doctors and so forth, seem to have comparatively more weight in lower middle income countries than they do in wealthy countries. And this is because these social impact jobs are more neglected. I think there's one stat rolling around that if you become a doctor in the US, because there are so many hundred doctors per 100,000 inhabitants, your chance of marginally saving a life, of actually being on a shift at the hospital, saving someone's life who would have died had you not been there, this kind of thing is very rare in the US, but in countries that don't have as good social infrastructure, if you do pursue, like they do need more people in these roles, and should you pursue a social impact job, you would actually have on margin more direct impact in those jobs. So traditional social impact jobs could be more attractive for people in lower middle income countries. Also, there's a unique ability to spread important ideas within your own country, whatever country that is. And a lot of EAs who come from wealthy countries try to do a lot of work in lower income countries or developing countries, but miss a lot of this tacit local knowledge that needs to be had. There's also a unique ability to assist important firms or organizations or NGOs. I think this is very similar to number 3, but 3 is maybe focused more on advocacy, and 4 is maybe more on direct work. If you want to read more about this, you can check out 80,000 Hours' short sketch on potentially promising career paths in poorer countries. There's also a post in the EA forum that links to some other articles on this by someone named Hillebrand. So some questions for our breakout right now. And these are optional. Feel free to talk about whatever you find interesting. But one is, what do you consider the most notable challenges and opportunities for EAs in low middle income countries? 2, the EA community lacks diversity with regard to global regions, especially from the global south. So what do you think is the best concrete step to improve this? I'd also be curious if any of you have considered moving to another country, or maybe have in the past moved to another country for EA reasons. And I'd love to hear from your experience. I think that's very interesting. I think others would be curious too.